All right. Well, I'm going to be mindful and respectful of both everyone here's time and the time of our panelists. I want to make sure that this is participatory. We have an opportunity to blather on all night, but I'd rather everyone be able to ask some questions. So I'm going to hit the panel with some questions, and then I'm going to let you do that. So be thinking about what you want to know, not to put you on the spot. But first, I would love to have the panel introduce themselves. Kurt Dammerman is with PCH and Lime Labs. Can you tell people what that is and how that's related to wearables?
Sure. So we are an engineering product development company that does consulting. So, and PCH, our parent company, is a manufacturer that basically is in consumer electronics and also in a lot of soft goods. So what we do is we see a lot of clients who come to us, startups, large corporations, and we help them develop those products, help them turn them into something that they can market at the right price with the right features for the customers.
Awesome. Yeah, I was just speaking to a class about resources for interesting things related to all things wearables. If you ever hear of an open event that PCH or Highway 1 are throwing, go to that. Lime Lab.
Yeah, those are fun.
Yeah. Awesome.
I taught him everything he knows.
Take all the credit, Barry. And this is Miriam Jouar.
Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing? Yeah, right on.
Right. Miriam is amazing. We hang out at the same coffee shop all the time when she's not traveling, and she's the chief evangelist for Pebble.
Yeah, that's right. If you're not familiar, we make a smartwatch, and it's a pretty successful and popular product. And I'm just here to basically, talk about the future. There's lots of interesting things going on. And I think a lot of it is, the reality versus the sci-fi part, right? Like there's all this cool stuff we could do and all this realistic stuff we can do. And I think it's very important to set those things apart.
All right. Maybe that's our rumble. I was asked specifically by some members of the panel to come up with controversial questions that would make people argue. Like maybe our argument is around sci-fi versus reality. Interesting. Think about that. All right. Barry Cates. Take us home. Go.
I work here. I'm a professor in, excuse me. I should also apologize. I just came back from Beijing, and I brought a fair amount of Beijing back with me in my lungs. So I do apologize for that. I work here. I'm a professor in industrial design and interaction design. I also teach in the product design program at Stanford, and I hang out at IDEO, the Global Design and Innovation Consultancy.
Yeah, I saw that. Fellow at IDEO. What does that mean? What do you do?
They're still trying to find out.
Interesting. He just hangs around. He's like the guy with the red swing line stapler who won't leave.
Actually, I'll give you a more serious and short answer to that, which is relevant to introducing myself, especially since Susan said that here at CCA we are all about the future. Except for me, I'm all about the past. So I am actually a historian. And part of the value that I've been trying to persuade people at IDEO and elsewhere that I add is that I don't think that there is a single project that you can be working on, no matter how future-oriented, from which we don't have something to learn from the past.
And that's why he's on stage. All right. So, Jonathan Pally, you are with Spire.io, and I'm embarrassed. The first time that we talked on the phone, but I hadn't really checked out his website, and I knew a little bit about your product, but I hadn't seen it. It's gorgeous.
Thank you.
It's really pretty.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful activity tracker. Why don't you tell people about it more?
Sure. So Spire, we try not to call it an activity tracker, though. So I'm trying to create controversy. So Spire is really, we're trying to build the future of what wearable physiological monitoring, right? Devices that are capturing our body signals can be. And we're very interested in not just capturing your physical activity, which we've seen a lot of products doing that, and it's increasingly commoditized, but also tracking the muscle that you use the most throughout the day, particularly knowledge workers and designers here, which is your mind, which is your brain. And so Spire is really the first device that's both about a healthy and productive body as well as mind. And we do that by looking at what's very accurate breathing signals. So it ends up that your breathing, your respiratory patterns, is one of the best reflections of your state of mind. When are you focused? When are you in the zone? When are you really productive? When are you tense? When are you calm? And so we're able to see all these and create some pretty cool feedback loops and change your smartwatch or your phone to suddenly become aware of how you are.
I actually really love that, and it feels like a great place to start because there's sort of the mind-body connection is interesting. And if you're tracking breath and state of mind, what are people going to be tracking next? That feels like an emergent space. Like, what are some other interesting things that you see people looking at in the wearable space or monitoring that you're like, oh, that's cool?
I can speak to that. I think temperature, body temperature is kind of an interesting one. Heart rate, obviously, that's been done before. I mean, this is not an area that we're experts at, but I'm just throwing things out there that I've seen that I think are potentially significant and relatively easy to measure.
Yeah, and you run around to a lot of events, so.
I was just say one thing that we talk a lot about, that just in doing this with Spire, because breathing is something we all know. It's a very common physiological signal, and we were almost surprised when we started working on this 2 years ago that no one had figured out how to do this in a wearable form factor. And I'm still kind of surprised about that, that we're quite ahead of everyone. And I think the reason is that, and we've talked to a lot of doctors about this, there's certain physiological signals that became popular within kind of the hospital setting. Heart, EKG is one of them. And it's very valuable. There's a reason it became popular. And I'm not totally convinced that when you start transferring that to something that's being continuously throughout your day monitored versus in a clinical setting, that necessarily there's a one-to-one correlation. And so I think we've started with tracking steps because that was pretty trivial to do, or not trivial, but it was easier to do given the sensor technology that's available, right? MEMS sensors because of phones, MEMS accelerometers largely because of the iPhone, the price went way down, so suddenly it became feasible to make it. The power consumption went way down. But now as we expand and are starting to look at doing more physiological signals, obviously heart rate is one that we all know very well. But I think we're going to discover physiological indicators that maybe before in the clinical setting was less interesting when you just had someone coming in to do it, but suddenly becomes much more interesting once you start capturing it longitudinally. And so I'm excited to see what comes out.
Yeah. You had something for that, Kurt.
Yeah, so we see clients who come to us and they want to track certain amounts of data, and one of the interesting bottlenecks is that they have to decide, they can collect a ton of data, but if a device has to fit on someone's wrist and has a certain battery size, they can't actually report that real time to another device. So it's not just what you're tracking, but it's how immediate that information needs to be is a huge part of designing wearables, and how do you create an interface where that makes sense for the type of data you're collecting.
So the people who are going to win are the people who are going to be able to what?
Well, if you can be more efficient and be really look at your interface, like which types of data can be downloaded at night, which types do they need immediate notifications about, and so to be smart about that, about power management. Because basically, it seems like the limiting factors for so many of these wrist devices is the size of someone's wrist, which is going to tell you roughly the size of your battery. So you have to be very smart about power management.
Yeah, and some people are working on solutions to that. So I ran at the O'Reilly Solid Conference, I ran into a company called Tembu, who discovered that they had been working in other categories, but what they discovered, they had been working in APIs, and they were working in the cloud, and they discovered that a lot of people were figuring out ways to use their product to store some information on the hardware itself and some information in the cloud, which created a bridge which allowed them to store more information in total and address that exact issue. So people are figuring that out.
I mean, I agree. Like, I think, I did the keynote recently in New York at the Wearable Tech Expo, and, the keynote was about the past, present, and future of smartwatches specifically. And, I think battery life is the number one challenge today. Display is probably up there as well. But, when you look at the wearables, I mean, I can't speak for all the wearables that exist. I certainly don't know how Spire works in great detail. But I know that if you look at, a more general purpose device like a smartwatch, what's out there right now, we are running a custom, basically a real-time OS. Why we're doing that is because it's much more efficient than running a heavy or duty OS like, say, Android or iOS on your wrist. And because of that, we can get away with like a very basic ARM processor like a Cortex M3 rather than, you know, the really complex processors that are used on phones, which is what, for example, Android Wear is using. So that immediately creates economies of scale in terms of battery life. And, you know, the way you manage the data and the way you manage connectivity, and then the display is a huge deal if you have a display. And right now, you know, that's the one thing I want you guys to take away from this, is that for the future, like the near future of wearables that have a display, you know, there is basically this line drawn in the sand right now, where on one side you have black and white, daylight readable, high efficiency, you know, lower resolution displays, like what we have on Pebble. It's called e-paper. It's not the same as e-ink on your Kindle, but kind of the same idea. And then you have, on the other side, you have the traditional phone displays, which shrunk down in size, IPS or AMOLED, uses much more power, is not daylight readable, I mean bright sunlight readable, and it's beautiful, right? It's gorgeous. We're used to it. But you can't have both. Like today, there's no way to do both. So if you're a smartwatch manufacturer, you pretty much have to pick one or make a watch that is available with both options.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are technologies being developed to solve these problems, but they're not at the point where they're affordable and more commonplace and mainstream. And I think, you know, this is kind of where I said earlier, like the sci-fi versus reality. This is the reality. If you are somebody like us today, or like Spire, who has to make a product today and sell it, you need to think of these things.
And just to be clear, you wouldn't use the AMOLED display because it would kill, the battery life is almost non-existent if you do that, right? Is that?
Well, obviously some people are doing that, but maybe they shouldn't.
Yes, they are. Well,
So part of it has to do too with, if you're a startup, your volumes are low, you are not going to convince a top tier display manufacturer to make you a custom display. So the large corporations of the world may be able to walk into that room and guarantee huge shipments and therefore get custom color displays, but they're still dealing with the power issue. Still the power issue. So.
I love that we're looking at this from so many different perspectives. I feel like we've got a good stage. And Miriam, I like that you brought up that your presentation was about the past, present, and future, because I want to hear from Barry about, so specifically, we had a conversation, and I asked him to show up with metaphors from the past that are analogous to what's happening in wearables right now, or that could be applied. You know, what's happening in technology that is a reflection of something that's already happened?
Well, the obvious thing is there is an almost universal trajectory for technologies to get smaller. And if we think of the most obvious one in the universe, and I'm sorry if this even sounds like a cliche, a computer, when they first began to be manufactured in the period after World War II, would fill a room of about the dimensions of Timken Auditorium. And it would have the processing power considerably less than what you guys are wearing on your wrists. I'm wearing a Timex.
Less than the timer that you use to cook your food with.
Yeah. So this is all, you know, kind of the familiar thing. And then it shrinks to the microscopic size of a very large refrigeration unit. And then it shrinks again, and the folks at Xerox PARC are building a computer that can actually sit on your desktop. And then it shrinks again, and it will sit on your laptop, and then on your palm. And now we're accustomed to wearing them on our wrists. So at one level, you know, we're almost inevitably asking, as it reduces once again by some order of magnitude in size, I don't want to be too cute about this, but what's the next orifice that our technologies are going to be looking for? And the kind of interesting design implication for this, as I think about it at any rate, is for the better part of the 20th century, designers were all schooled in this single mantra that everybody in this room has heard and perhaps memorized: form follows function, right? So if you're building a radio, the radio is going to be a plastic skin wrapped around vacuum tubes and resistors and speakers and things like that. And as it shrinks more and more and more, so that the power plant is finally something small enough to fit on the tip of your finger, then it's not that form becomes irrelevant, but it becomes subject to completely different sorts of determinants. They're not technical anymore, in a sense. They are physiological, they are cognitive, they are emotional, and it becomes a much, much, much more interesting game. And who knows how that's going to play out.
Well, and I love that you brought up orifices.
I tend to.
Well, because so in the class that I was just speaking with people about Proteus Health, and it's not wearables, but it's close enough. For I think most people here know what that is, but they created an ingestible sensor that does all sorts of monitoring and connects into an app on your phone to say, are you taking your pills, among other things. And that's
I mean, that's how I ended my presentation. Implants, right? I mean, I really think it's the next logical step. I mean, it just makes sense.
Speak to that, Kurt.
Yeah, we've already seen probably this year 3 or 4 clients who are interested in earbuds with more, right? That's so the ear is maybe the next orifice before implants, but yeah. So, but one of the things, I just to throw this out there, so wireless, right? Like wireless to transmit takes power, and I think this is something that's interesting as an obstacle. I also think as an obstacle. So EMI, right? Like how much are you emitting, and how much then can you emit inside your body? I don't know, right? So wireless to me is another obstacle that I think there's a paradigm there that someone has to break, right?
So it's funny you mention that, because I used to work in hearing research, and hearing aids today are wireless, right? They can be paired from one ear to the other, paired to your phone, whether Bluetooth. But Bluetooth, of course, 2400 megahertz. Is not going to work underwater. It doesn't work really well through your head. That's why if you look at hearing aid manufacturers, typically they use custom radios that are 900 megahertz, which is an open spectrum from the FCC. So, my background's in engineering, obviously you can tell. But the thing is, 900 megahertz works because it goes through your head. And so they don't have to transmit power very, very strongly for these 2 hearing aids to work in tandem. And so, this is super critical. Like, eventually, and I think Jonathan can speak to this, and I want him to. Wireless charging, right? I mean, this is, ultimately, devices are going to become so small, you won't be able to put a connector on it. Like, Pebble has a bespoke magnetic, like MagSafe, similar to Apple connector, primarily because it takes very little room inside the watch, and we need all the room we can use. And also it's waterproof, which we need. And USB has pins, the pins move, water goes in, doesn't work. But it's primarily because of space. And so, you scale down to his size device, and all of a sudden, you don't even have room for a connector. So what do? Again, wireless.
Well, and Jonathan made the very conscious and specific choice to make his wireless, right? Like,
we did, yeah. I mean, oops, sorry. So Spire is like a stone. You can see it on the, and this is not a cosmetically accurate one, but so it's a stone, right? And it's completely sealed and it's completely curved. There's no flat edges whatsoever on it. And there was a few reasons we did that. One was we did wireless for a few reasons. One was that as we talk to users about their experience with these devices, is that we just don't like plugging things in. Personally, I don't like plugging things in. Right? It's a painful process, and at first I thought the issue was charging, and I realized that's not really the problem. It's that I don't like having an extra cable, and I don't like plugging things in, and so wireless started making a lot of sense in that regard. But then the second thing is we started thinking about what is the form of something that feels comfortable against the body, right? That feels natural against the body, and Spire is something that's designed to be worn by and large invisible. Right, we're coming out with ones that have a shiny clip. So if you want to kind of be blinged out a little bit, that's cool. But otherwise, I personally don't want it to be visible. I mean, I do because I want to promote the company. But in general, for things I don't want it to be visible. But I still want it to be comfortable. And so we came out with we wanted something that's a very organic shape. Right, something that felt very organic, and flat lines are not organic, right? And to make a pogo pin things, you need those flat lines. And so wireless solved 2 problems, or we think solves 2 problems. One was around a great, a better user experience. We think around charging it, because you just drop it down on the charging pad. And the second one is that we're able, our design constraints, the form constraints, as both everyone was talking about here, were opened up. Right, and so we could have something that was just 100% curved and was truly a natural organic shape.
You made me think. I was over here checking my phone, and I'm not ignoring him, I'm not like zoning out. But I was trying to think of. I had heard about smart bowls, and people using that as a method of charging. It was Intel. I was trying to think. There are a few different people who have come out with a mechanism for just sort of drop your device in and charge it that way. Or who
So it's called resonance.
Trying.
That's called resonance, that technology. That's the next generation of wireless charging. So right now, we have something called Qi wireless charge. We follow the Qi. It's Qi compatible. And that in this technology, wireless charging, it's not ideal. We think it's a step forward. You have to put it physically on a pad. There's a coil here, and it has to be not necessarily in contact, but it has to be parallel to that. With resonance charging, it's and so this is inductive. Resonance charging is more about, well, I won't get to the physics of it, but basically it just needs to be nearby, right? And so I think we're making those kinds of progresses, which are really exciting. But you do also have these, then you have the radiation questions, right? Well, what is safe? How comfortable are we having this next to our bed, right? Where is that line? It's something we're very aware of, right? This is Bluetooth Low Energy and it's next to your skin. Well, that we've studied very carefully, and we know that 2.4 gigahertz doesn't penetrate the skin, particularly very far, particularly at the power that this is at. But we're opening up a whole new Pandora's box of questions, which is quite interesting.
I mean, if you want this sort of this cell phone watch, right? If you want that, it's a different regulation with regard to safety, because that's a device that's classified as something that's strapped to you, right? So it seems to me, unless someone figures out something really innovative, you cannot have coverage as good as you have on a cell phone, because it is a different regulation. So no matter who makes that watch, unless they figure out a way, they have to basically turn the radio down. They have to basically give you fewer bars, right, on transmit.
I mean, this is a long. I mean, there's all these raging debates, right? Wireless charging versus wired. There is, monochrome back displays versus color, low energy versus, high consumption displays. There is, that's one of them, right? I mean, the reality is you are going to have a phone on your body right now, somewhere in your bag, in your knapsack. I mean, this is not going to change for a few years. So we can kind of count on the phone becoming the router that you carry around that either jumps onto Wi-Fi or jumps onto LTE or some sort of cellular technology to connect you to the cloud. And in some cases you want to connect to the cloud. But I think as we progress, what I want to see and what Pebble is working on with other partners to make happen is kind of a mesh network of low energy devices that all can aggregate a bit of data. So that we're talking about what you were saying before, where it doesn't always have to go to the cloud, because that's inefficient, uses battery, transmits power. It's a whole problem. It's a whole can of worms. But if these devices can all collaborate and gather the data intelligently and then dump it to the cloud when needed, it's a much more efficient way of doing things. Also, then you have the option of going on a hike for a week. Like Pebble's battery life is 5 to 7 days, average use. We've seen people up to 12 days. If you go on a hike for a week, you can have some standalone stuff running. You can gather data about your hike without ever connecting to the cloud. And then when you get back, the local storage all goes back to the cloud, or whatever parts of it go back to the cloud. And I think that's the key. I think that we're going to see manufacturers. Here's the thing you're going to see: the consumer electronics companies, not the watch companies, not the people who are making watches of the 21st century, but the Samsungs and LGs of the world. They're going to be making watches with cellular connectivity, because the only way they know how to make money is to subsidize these devices by selling them through the carrier, the operator. And you're going to have to get a subscription for that watch to be able to use it, in the same way as they're all trying to sell you tablets with built-in wireless, right? So that's their business model. And so you have to also understand that all of the stuff we're talking about for the future, you have to understand the market. I was an editor writing at Engadget for 3.5 years, and I've seen all this happen. Half the time I would bang my head against the wall trying to figure out why they were doing things, when it's just a business model. And it doesn't make any sense in terms of technology. And certainly doesn't make any sense for you, because it's raping the consumer with taking money out of their pockets for nothing. So when you hear somebody says that all the devices around us are going to have some sort of cellular connectivity, it's bullshit. It's not going to happen. That's not the solution to the problem.
So I want some speculation here. I am awash in questions right now. I've got one that, Barry, I'm going to pull you in just a second. But since we're already talking about why people are doing things, why did Apple just enter the category? Nobody knows, but everyone can speculate.
We know.
Why?
It's very simple. Tim Cook is a health and fitness nut. He's been on the board of a company called Nike, and they've been doing a product called Nike Plus. They just recently canceled their hardware side of things, and because Apple's developed hardware that's better. And, you know, for him, it's important that there's also a healthcare crisis in the US. A lot of people are sick, a lot of people have weird ailments or need to monitor their health. And so it just makes sense that they make a device for their ecosystem that addresses the health and fitness issues while being fashionable, and also do things like notifications, which Pebble does really well, et cetera, et cetera. I think it just makes perfect sense.
So anybody want to challenge that? Anybody got another reason?
I think wearable devices is something that their brand, because it's always been, you know, a little bit more fashionable. I think they have definitely got an advantage in that space, and I think it's a place they would like to go, right? And you can see by the hires they've been making that, yeah, you know, and it's not a bad match. Sometimes when you think about wearables, you think about like how long does a consumer electronics device last before you want the next generation, and how long do jeans last? It's kind of like the same time frame, right?
I think Apple builds ecosystems. They build platforms. They don't build devices. So the question is what, you know, and I think it's partly of what you were saying before about that there's going to be a mesh network or a low energy ecosystem around the body. I mean, this is speculation. I don't know, but I think my framework of looking at what Apple does is that they build platforms, right? And so if the wrist becomes or whatever, the device other than the phone becomes a key player in that lower energy network, then that's an ecosystem Apple needs to be.
Yeah,
Barry, what do you add to that?
Yeah.
Well, I just had one thought. A fair amount of this is over my head, so keep it up. This is really interesting. And the analogy that comes to my mind is, of course, the wristwatch. So you've got versions of wrist wearable devices now that can do an insane number of things. The first wristwatches were introduced in practical terms, around World War I to allow soldiers to synchronize their movements. So at the stroke of this, you know, you run over there and have somebody shoot at you, which seemed to make sense to somebody
Excellent.
at the time.
What's the killer application now? No pun intended. Sorry.
Yeah, it's actually very, very good. In the future, I'd like to be making the jokes here.
Sorry.
Slam.
Okay, so, and then something very, very interesting will happen, which is, I think it is in 1972, Intel introduced the first digital watch, about the same time that HP did one as well. And they did it because Gordon Moore and his friends at Intel said, listen, we are the world's masters at miniaturization. What else can we do besides build chips? And somebody said, we can build a this, we can build a that. We could build a wristwatch that is ripe for a technology of miniaturization. So they proceeded to build and introduce a technological marvel called the Microma, which is probably the ugliest watch ever created in the history of timekeeping devices, which says quite a bit, by the way. There's going to be competition for that, yeah. And then HP followed suit shortly thereafter with a calculator watch with a little tiny stylus that fit into the band, and you took it out and punched the keys with the stylus, which were microscopic, until you lost it and it was useless, and so on.
And then you could use a pen. That was the whole design.
Yeah,
Ball
yeah.
pen.
But then the next stage in that, and you'll see why this story, I think, becomes somewhat relevant, was when Seiko of Seiko Epson proceeded almost to put Switzerland out of business, because Seiko came around to the Swiss watchmakers in Geneva and said, we've got this technology that can significantly, nobody was using the language of disruption then, but in effect significantly disrupt the technology of chronometers, of wristwatches. And the Swiss looked at it, and in the snotty way that Swiss people have, if they said, get that the hell out of here, it's a piece of technology. We are producing pieces of jewelry. And it was some time before we began to think about some kind of a reconciliation between the aesthetics of a wearable and the enabling technology of a wearable. And I personally think that the whole future of wearables lies in finding that point of intersection between the aesthetics, which has, I mean, the word itself means about the senses, something that has some kind of meaningful intersection with our bodies and, you know, our desire to display and project and ornament and things like that, with the underlying enabling technology. And when that point hits, I think we'll begin to see some really, really interesting developments.
I actually have a lot to say to all of this, if you guys don't mind, since I'm the watch person here. I agree with all of you. First of all, and it's funny because I just, in my presentation in New York, did a history of the wristwatch, and all of this is accurate. And the thing is, a lot of people know from like 2005 onward roughly what happened, because, you know, it's still pretty fresh in our heads. But there's so much interesting stuff that happened, you know, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And so I covered it all. But I agree with you. You know, I think that ultimately, the thing about wearables is, and you see this, Pebble is, you know, it's successful as a smartwatch because maybe it doesn't have everything but the kitchen sink on it. But it's attractive, and you know we provide choices of color, material, and basically 2 shapes and sizes right now. You know, because we're a small company, and as you said, it's hard to get manufacturers to do what you want them to do in terms of the parts you need. But the reality is that we took the watch. Like if you buy a Pebble, you don't even have to connect it to a phone. It works out of the box as a watch. You can tell the time. It's waterproof, has good battery life. And then, you know, connect it to your phone, all of a sudden you get notifications. And then if you really want to be a fancy user, you can go to the App Store and download apps for your watch. And then it's a whole universe. And you peel these layers and you get more functionality out of them. But ultimately, it's a watch. We just kick, we dragged it kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And so, again, because it's such a personal device, it's all about, you know, making it yours. So we standard bands, you can customize the band. You know, watch faces, you can change the watch faces, so you have a different design on the watch face every time. You know, the fact that we're aware people like colors, and all this stuff is super important, because when you get to wearables, it's all very personal, much more than the phone is. And so I think that's the key. If you're designing wearables today, you know, the design is probably more important than the functionality at this point. And I think that the functionality needs to be simple and add value. Otherwise, forget it.